I was stranded on an ice planet, and she keeps stealing my heat. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Logan West had been in tight situations before, but this was something else entirely. The moment his ship's hull had been ripped open by an unexpected debris field, alarms had shrieked through the cockpit, red warning lights flashing as the cold void of space threatened to claim him. He barely had time to react, scrambling through emergency procedures, fighting against the inevitable. But in the end, gravity had made the final decision for him. The planet had appeared on his navigation screen. Just as his engines died, the last of his thrusters burning out, as he lost control, the ship spiraling downward at terminal velocity. He braced for impact, knowing there was no avoiding the crash. The world below, an endless expanse of white, rushed up to meet him. And then darkness. The cold was what woke him, a biting, suffocating cold that sunk deep into his bones, worse than anything he'd ever felt. Worse than the brutal winters on Titan III, where he'd once trained his breath, was a fog in the frozen air as he forced himself to move, muscle-stiff, head pounding. The wreckage of his ship burned in the distance, the only source of warmth in the otherwise frozen wasteland, casting flickering light against jagged ice formations that rose from the ground. Like teeth, his emergency suit had saved him, but it wouldn't last forever. The insulation was already struggling against the sub-zero temperatures, the warning systems blinking in his HUD, flashing red, urging him to find shelter before hypothermia set in. Logan scanned the area, his military training kicking in wide-out conditions. No clear landmarks, no sign of civilization. His ship was a dead husk, the distressed beacon buried under a twisted mess of metal and ice. He had no way to call for help, no way to know if anyone would come. His best bet was to find something, anything that could keep him alive long enough to figure out a plan. He moved with measured steps, pushing through knee snow, the wind howling around him like a living thing. Then he saw her. At first, he thought she was a hallucination, a trick of the light. But as he staggered forward, he realized she was real, a figure crouched in the snow, her body trembling violently, thin arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to ward off the cold. She was alien, no doubt about that. Her skin was a pale frost blue, her hair a cascade of soft blonde that was already laced with ice crystals. Her eyes were large, unnervingly bright against the frozen landscape, locking onto him the moment he moved closer. She was barefoot, barely clothed, her entire form trembling, her breath ragged, as if every exhale was a fight to stay conscious. Logan took another step toward her, instinctively reaching out. But before he could speak, she launched herself at him. He barely had time to react before she collided with his chest, her body pressing flush against his, her arms clutching at his sides like a vice. He staggered backward, his first instinct to push her off. But the second he felt her ice-cold skin through his suit, he realized what was happening. She was freezing to death, her body was like ice, and she was desperately seeking warmth. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his suit, her breath coming in quick, desperate gasps as she buried her face against his chest, her entire form shaking violently. He hesitated, his survival instincts wearing with his military training. He didn't know what species she was, didn't know if she was dangerous. But one thing was clear, she was dying. Logan exhaled sharply and wrapped his arms around her. The reaction was immediate, a shudder ran through her. And then she all but melted against him, pressing closer, her body molding to his in a way that sent an unexpected jolt through his system. He wasn't sure how much of it was instinct, how much was desperation, but the way she clung to him, the way her breath hitched as the warmth of his body seeped into hers, it was clear that she needed this to survive. He tightened his grip and forced himself to focus. The cold wasn't going to wait for them to figure things out. He needed shelter fast. His HUD was already flashing more warning, the suit struggling to maintain internal heat with the added drain of sharing warmth. He looked down at her, trying to gauge her condition. Her eyes were half-lighted, exhaustion pulling at her features, her limbs limp against him. She was still shaking, but less violently now, her breathing slowing as the warmth worked through her system. "I don't know if you understand me," he muttered, adjusting his hold on her, "but we need to move." She didn't respond, but when he started walking, she didn't resist. If anything, She pressed closer, her arms tightening around him, her tail wrapping around his waist. Instinctively, Logan felt the soft, furred appendage coil against him, its presence both startling and strangely natural, as if she were anchoring herself to him. He pushed forward, ignoring the odd sensation, focusing on the task at hand. The landscape was brutal, an endless expanse of snow and jagged ice, but he spotted something in the distance, a dark crevice in the side of a rock formation. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He adjusted his grip on the woman alien and pressed forward, the wind howling against them, his body already numb from the cold. She barely moved, her face still buried against him, but he could feel the faint tremors running through her, the quiet, exhausted breaths against his chest. By the time they reached the cave, Logan was running on pure adrenaline. He ducked inside, shielding her from the wind, his body shaking from exertion and the relentless cold. The cave was shallow, barely offering enough room for them to sit, but it was something. He lowered himself against the rock wall, adjusting so she was still pressed against him, her body draped over his lap, her arms still locked around his torso, like she refused to let go. Now that they were out of the wind, he could feel how deeply she had burrowed into his warmth. Her tail was still coiled around his waist, her legs tucked up against his sides, and her hands, now slightly warmer, gripped the fabric of his suit like a lifeline. He could feel her breathing slow and steady, now her forehead resting against his neck, and for the first time since crashing, Logan exhaled, the weight of everything settling over him. He was stranded on an ice planet, his ship was destroyed, he had no way to call for help. And now he had an alien woman wrapped around him like a human space heater. Logan L. His head hit the wall behind him and closed his eyes, exhaling a cloud of fog into the cold air. Yeah, this was going to be one hell of a survival mission. Logan woke to the distinct sensation of something warm pressed against him. An unfamiliar weight sprawled across his chest, the slow, steady rhythm of breath against his neck. For a moment, disoriented and still groggy from exhaustion, he almost forgot where he was. The cave's dim interior was a slight reprieve from the relentless cold outside, but the air still carried an unforgiving chill seeping into his bones. Despite the layers of his suit, his limbs ached stiff from both the brutal crash and the desperate trek through the snow. But what truly caught his attention was the alien woman curled tightly against him, her slender body completely draped over his. She was impossibly close, pressed into him like they were one entity, her arms locked around his torso with an almost vice-like grip. Her tail remained snugly wrapped around his waist, a surprisingly thick furred appendage that radiated a faint warmth of its own. Every shift of her body sent a jolt of heat through him, and as his brain slowly registered just how deeply she had burrowed into his space, his initial survival-driven instincts went with an entirely different kind of discomfort. He hadn't been this close to another person in a long time, and the intimacy of it, however unintentional, was something his mind struggled to process. She stirred slightly, a quiet sound escaping her lips, barely more than a breath, but enough to tell him she was waking. Her face was still pressed against his chest, her fingers twitching against the fabric of his suit, as if instinctively testing whether he was still warm enough for her to cling to. Logan took a slow, measured breath, forcing himself to remain still, unwilling to startle her into some kind of panic. He had no idea how her species reacted to sudden movements, no idea how much of their situation she even understood, and the last thing he needed was to make things worse by acting unpredictably. Her eyes fluttered open, their luminous glow adjusting to the dimness of the cave, and for a brief moment there was nothing but silence between them. Logan could feel the exact second she became aware of just how tightly she was pressed against him, because her entire body tensed, her fingers curled slightly against his chest, her breath catching in her throat. As she blinked up at him, confusion flickering across her features, he half expected her to shove herself away, maybe recoil in embarrassment or even alarm. But instead she simply stared at him for a long, unreadable moment before slowly relaxing again, as if deciding that detaching from him wasn't a necessary course of action. He cleared his throat, doing his best to ignore the way her tail gave the faintest squeeze around his waist. "You warm enough now?" His voice was rough from disuse, the cold having sapped the moisture from his throat and he could barely recognize the dry asasp. Of his own words, he wasn't even sure if she could understand him, but it was something to break the silence. She tilted her head slightly as if considering his question, then nodded once. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft but carried a strange melodic quality, the unfamiliar lilt of an alien tongue he couldn't decipher. He caught the way her mouth moved around syllables that had no meaning to him, but even as she spoke, her grip on him didn't loosen. It was clear she wasn't willing to let go just yet. Logan sighed, shifting slightly to ease the strain in his lower back. He wasn't exactly opposed to keeping warm. Survival came first after all, but he needed to figure out what came next. All right, listen, I don't know what you're saying, and I don't think you understand me, but we can't just sit here forever. He gestured loosely toward the mouth of the cave, where the faintest slivers of pale light from the frozen landscape outside barely crept through the opening. The storm had calmed slightly, but the wind still howled in the distance, carrying an ominous reminder that they weren't out of danger. Yet she watched him carefully, her gaze flicking between his face and the cave entrance, and for the first time he saw something deeper in her expression, understanding, maybe not of his exact words, but of the situation. She exhaled slowly, then hesitated before finally unwrapping her tail from his waist, pulling back just enough to give them both a sliver of space. The loss of her warmth was immediate, a sharp cant against the bitter air, but he forced himself to push past it. Logan reached for his equipment, checking his suit's status and assessing what he had left in terms of supplies. His rations were limited, barely enough to last a few days, and his water supply was even worse. His suit's filtration system could handle melting ice into drinkable water, but it would only work for so long before breaking down. His primary concern, however, was the beacon buried under the wreckage. If he had any hope of rescue, he needed to get back to his ship's remains and dig it out before the cold claimed them both. The woman alien, he reminded himself, watched him closely as he worked, her sharp gaze never leaving his hands as he adjusted his gear. She seemed fascinated by the small mechanical adjustments, tilting her head slightly whenever he interacted with the suit's interface. He wasn't sure how technologically advanced her people were, but from her reaction, it seemed like his equipment wasn't something she saw every day. After a few more minutes, he gestured toward himself. Then the cave entrance. We need to move, he said firmly, hoping the tone would get his point across, even if the words didn't. He repeated the motion, emphasizing their need to leave, and after a brief pause, she gave a small nod. She was quicker to her feet than he expected, graceful despite the cold, though he noticed the way she wrapped her arms around herself almost immediately, the absence of his body heat already affecting her. Without thinking too much about it, he reached toward her, grabbing her hand and pressing it against the insulated fabric of his suit. She let out a quiet exhale, relief flashing across her features, and though he knew this was probably just a survival instinct for her, there was something deeply unsettling about how easily she accepted his warmth, how natural it seemed for her to take what she needed from him. Logan shook off the thought and moved toward the cave entrance, bracing himself for the inevitable blast of cold. As he stepped out into the frozen wasteland, the wind bit at his exposed skin, the sky above a dull gray void stretching endlessly over the ice-covered terrain. The wreckage of his ship wasn't far, still partially smoldering against the snow-twisted metal jutting up from the impact site like jagged ruins. He knew the beacon was under there somewhere, but retrieving it wouldn't be easy. The woman followed closely behind him, sticking to his side like a shadow. He could feel her presence without even looking. The way she moved in sync with him, her body angled slightly toward his, like she was ready to latch onto his warmth at a moment's notice. They had no shared language, no real understanding of each other yet, but it didn't matter right now. They had a common goal: survive. As they started toward the wreckage, Logan couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He wasn't alone anymore, and whether he liked it or not, the strange heat-seeking alien woman beside him wasn't about to let him go. The wreckage was still smoldering, though the flames had mostly been reduced to glowing embers beneath layers of fresh snow. Logan could see where the hull had split upon impact. Jagged metal twisted up like the ribs of a long-dead beast. It was a disaster zone. Debris scattered across the frozen ground, some pieces buried so deep in the ice that they'd need hours of digging to free the beacon, was in there, somewhere buried beneath the ruined structure, and retrieving it was the only way he had a chance of getting off this planet alive. He took a steadying breath, trying to ignore the biting cold that was already seeping past his suit's insulation, and turned toward the woman at his side. She was watching the wreckage with an unreadable expression, her large luminous eyes scanning the remains with something that almost looked like caution. The wind pulled at her pale hair strands, whipping against her face as she shifted closer to him, her arms wrapped around herself once more. Even without speaking, it was clear that she was uncomfortable, though whether it was from the cold or something else he couldn't tell. She had yet to put any real distance between them since their first meeting, always sticking close enough to share warmth. But now her body language was different, tense, wary. Logan wasn't in the mood to waste time trying to decipher alien emotions. He had a job to do, and that beacon wasn't going to dig itself out. He moved forward, testing his footing as he navigated the wreckage, careful not to step onto any unstable surfaces. Some parts of the ship were still hot, the metal radiating a faint heat, but most of it was rapidly cooling under the relentless cold. His gloves were thick enough to protect against burns, but he was more concerned about jagged edges and hidden pockets of fuel that hadn't fully ignited. One wrong move, and this already bad situation could get worse. The woman followed, stepping lightly over the snow-covered debris, her movements surprisingly fluid despite the freezing conditions. She made no sound as she moved, no crunch of snow, no sharp exhale against the wind, just a quiet presence at his side, watching his every move with sharp, assessing eyes. He wasn't sure what she was looking for, or if she even understood what he was doing, but she seemed focused on him in a way that made it clear she wasn't just aimlessly following Ning. She was studying him, taking in every action, like she was trying to make sense of him. Logan reached a section where the ship's frame had partially collapsed, creating a tangled mess of metal and ruined circuitry. The beacon was likely somewhere beneath this, crushed under tons of debris. He exhaled, adjusting his grip on the tool he'd salvaged from his emergency kit, a compact plasma cutter meant for small-scale repairs, not heavy-duty excavation. It would take time to cut through the layers of wreckage, but he didn't have another choice. He powered it on, the blue flame humming to life as he pressed it to the first piece of metal, sparks flying as he worked. The woman flinched at the sound. Her ears, had they always been that pointed, twitching slightly as the sparks reflected in her wide eyes. She took a half-step back, tail flicking once before settling around her own waist. Logan glanced at her, but didn't stop working, the rhythmic buzz of the cutter filling the otherwise silent expanse of ice and ruin. Minutes passed, then longer. The wind howled, swirling loose snow around them, making visibility difficult, but Logan forced himself to keep going. His fingers were numb despite the suit, his breaths coming in steady puffs of vapor. The beacon had to be close. He could feel it. Then suddenly the woman tensed. Logan barely had time to react before she grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so lean. He snapped his head toward her, ready to pull away, but her expression stopped him. Her eyes weren't just wide, they were alert, sharp, filled with something dangerously close to panic. She let out a low, urgent sound, speaking quickly in her native tongue. But he still couldn't understand her. What he did understand was the way she turned her head sharply toward the darkness beyond the wreckage, her whole body going rigid. Something was out there. Logan shut off the plasma cutter, the sudden silence pressing down on them like a weight. He listened, straining against the wind, searching for what had set her off at first. There was nothing, just the steady whistle of air against ice, the distant groan of shifting metal as the wreck continued to settle, but then barely audible beneath it all there was a different sound, a low guttural growl, distant but growing closer. He cursed it under his breath, reaching instinctively for his sidearm, a standard issue plasma pistol, still functional but running low on power after the crash. He had no idea what kind of predators roam this planet, but judging by the way the woman was reacting, it wasn't something small. The growl came again, closer this time, and Logan caught the faintest flicker of movement in the swirling snow beyond the wreck, his grip on the pistol tightened. Whatever was out there wasn't friendly. The woman moved before he could. 1 second she was at his side, and the next she was crouching low, tail flicking behind her, her entire stance shifting. From cautious to something more dangerous, Logan barely had time to register the change before she let out a sharp chittering sound, not quite a growl, but something that felt like a warning, a challenge. The thing in the snow responded immediately. A massive shape surged forward, breaking through the whiteout conditions like a living nightmare. Logan caught a glimpse of glistening ice blue fur, a monstrous body, rippling with muscle-clawed limbs, digging deep into the snow with every powerful step, its eyes sunken and black, locked onto them with predatory focus, its lined with rows of razor-sharp teeth. Instinct took over. Logan raised his pistol, firing a shot straight at its head. The plasma bolt hit, but the creature barely flinched, shaking off the impact. Like an afterthought, it let out a furious snarl, bearing toward them at an alarming speed. The woman lunged. She was faster than Logan expected, moving with an unnatural grace that sent her straight toward the beast without hesitation. Her claws, when the hell had she extended claws, slashed through the air, catching the creature's side as she twisted mid-leap, dodging a snapping jaw with precision that was almost too perfect. She landed lightly on the wreckage, using the height to keep herself just out of reach. Logan didn't hesitate. He fired again, aiming for its exposed flank, and this time the shot connected with a sickening hiss. The beast howled in pain, stumbling slightly, but it wasn't done yet. It turned its attention back to him, locking onto him with murderous intent. He braced for the attack, but the woman moved first, her body colliding with the beast's side. In a blur of movement, they hit the ground in a tangle of limbs, the snow kicking up around them, obscuring the fight. Logan could hear snarling the clash of claws against flesh, but he couldn't get a clear shot without risking hitting her. Then abruptly the beast let out a final pain shriek before going still. When the snow settled, the woman was standing over the now lifeless body, her breathing heavy, her claws dripping with blackened blood. She turned toward him, eyes sharp, but there was no trace of fear in her expression, only certainty. Logan lowered his pistol, exhaling slowly. They weren't alone on this planet, and if this thing had been hunting them, there were likely more. This just got a whole lot worse. Logan stood there, his breath coming in steady clouds of vapor, his grip on the pistol still firm as he stared at the unmoving body of the beast sprawled across the ice. It was massive, its thick, ice-covered fur still twitching slightly as the last remnants of life bled out into the frozen ground. He had no idea what it was, no way of knowing if it was some mutated predator or a natural inhabitant of this frozen wasteland. But one thing was clear: it had been hunting them. And it wouldn't be the last. The thought sent a chill through him, one that had nothing to do with the cold, because if there was one, there were more. And if these things hunted in packs, then their situation had just gone from dire to damn near impossible. His gaze shifted to the woman. Veyna, he decided to call her, though she had yet to introduce herself in a way he could understand. She was still standing over the carcass, her posture tense, but controlled, her sharp clawed fingers slowly retracting as she stepped away from the body. There was no fear in her expression, no uncertainty in the way she moved, just a quiet understanding that she had done what needed to be done. She had fought with an efficiency that unsettled him, an almost unnatural grace that suggested she had done this before, maybe many times. He had no idea what kind of life she had lived before she ended up on this planet, but he was beginning to suspect she was far more dangerous than her slender frame suggested. She turned toward him, those unnervingly large eyes locking onto his, and for a moment they simply stood there, neither speaking, neither moving. Then, without warning, she reached out and pressed her palm against his chest, right over his heart, her fingers curling slightly into the fabric of his suit. The touch was light, but there was something deliberate about it, something searching. He wasn't sure if she was checking to see if he was injured, or if this was some alien gesture he didn't understand. But he let her do it, too aware of the way she had just saved his ass to push her away. "I'm fine," he muttered, even though he knew she couldn't understand him. Her fingers lingered a moment longer before she pulled back, her tail flicking slightly behind her as she exhaled slowly, visibly calming now that the immediate danger had passed. Logan holstered his weapon and turned back to the wreckage, his mind shifting gears. The beacon, that was still priority number One, they could deal with whatever else this planet had to throw at them. After he secured a way to call for help with renewed urgency, he climbed over a collapsed section of the ship, scanning the debris for any sign of the distressed beacon. It should have been somewhere near the cockpit, but the impact had thrown everything into chaos, and it was hard to tell where anything had ended up. Veyna followed him, her movements fluid and silent, sticking close enough that he could feel the occasional brush of her warmth against him. Whenever she moved past, he wasn't sure if she was keeping close out of necessity or something else, but at this point he was beginning to accept that she wasn't going to stray far from him. If this was her way of surviving, of staying warm, then so be it. He had bigger things to worry about. He finally spotted a half-buried section of the control panel and wrenched it free, gritting his teeth against the strain as metal groaned in protest. Beneath it, partially crushed, but still intact, was the stress beacon. Relief flooded through him as he pulled it out, brushing snow and debris off the casing, his fingers fumbling to check if it was still functional. The screen flickered weakly, the signal light blinking at a sluggish, intermittent pace. Not a good sign. Come on, he muttered, adjusting the settings, trying to boost the signal. The cold had sapped power from the internal battery, and the damage from the crash wasn't helping. It needed time to charge, which meant they needed to stay put until the signal could stabilize. That was a problem. Veyna crouched beside him, her head tilting as she watched him work, curiosity flickering in her expression. He wasn't sure how much she understood about technology, but she seemed aware that the device was important. He gestured toward the beacon, then up at the sky, trying to pantomime the idea of sending a signal. She watched him for a long moment, then slowly nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly in thought. It was the first real confirmation he had that she was trying to understand him, and that alone gave him a sliver of hope that communication wouldn't always be this frustrating. He sat back, flexing his fingers against the cold, his body aching from both exertion and the relentless temperature. Veyna, without hesitation, moved closer again, pressing against his side like it was the most natural thing in the world. He stiffened slightly but didn't push her away. He had long since accepted that this was just how she functioned. She ran cold, and he was the close source of warmth. There was no point in resisting it any more. Time passed in slow, tense silence. Logan kept a wary eye on their surroundings, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The wind had picked up again, sending spirals of snow whipping through the air, reducing visibility even further. He hated this, hated being vulnerable, hated sitting out in the open with no proper cover, hated that he was relying on a weak distress signal that might not even reach anyone. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to move, to find a better position, to do something instead of just waiting. But he knew he had no choice if he wanted any chance of rescue. This was the only play he had left. Veyna, to his surprise, seemed just as tense as he was. Her posture was rigid, her ears, he was sure now that they were more pointed than human ears, twitching slightly at every distant sound. She wasn't fully relaxed, wasn't completely comfortable. Despite her body pressing against his, she was on edge, just like he was, and that realization unsettled him. If she, a native of this planet, was uneasy, then that meant they weren't safe. The thought barely had time to settle before she suddenly straightened, her body going completely still. Logan immediately followed her gaze, scanning the distance, but at first he saw nothing but the endless expanse of white. Then slowly, almost too faint to notice at first, shadows emerged from the storm shapes, moving against the snow, large, deliberate, circling, more of them. Logan's heart pounded. The one they had just killed hadn't been alone. After all, they were being hunted. Veyna let out a low rumbling sound, not quite a growl, not quite a warning, but something in between. The creatures responded in kind, their movements becoming sharper, more focused. There were 3 of them this time, maybe more, hidden in the storm, massive bodies blending almost too well into the environment. Logan's mind raced. They couldn't fight that many, even with Veyna of speed and his weapon. They were outnumbered, outmatched. They needed to move. Now he grabbed the beacon, stuffing it into his suit, then turned to Veyna, gesturing toward the caves in the distance. He didn't know if she had a better hiding place, but it was the only real cover they had. She hesitated for only a split second before nodding, understanding exactly what he meant. Then together they ran the cold cut through him like a blade, but Logan forced his legs to keep moving, his breath coming in ragged gasps. As he sprinted across the snow, the wind howled against him, whipping his face with ice crystals, his boots sinking into the deep frost. With every step slowing him down, his body screamed at him to stop, to conserve energy, but he knew what was behind them. Knew what was closing, and stopping wasn't an option. The creatures weren't just circling anymore. They were moving, advancing, their massive forms slipping through the storm like living shadows, packing them, testing how far they could run before exhaustion took over. Veyna moved beside him, her steps lighter, faster. She barely left an imprint in the snow, her form almost fluid, and how effortlessly she cut through the frozen landscape. He didn't know if her species was built for this environment, or if it was just survival instinct honed over time, but she didn't seem weighed down the way he was every now and then. She glanced over at him, her sharp eyes scanning his movements as if calculating something, but she didn't stop. She didn't offer to slow down for him either, and he didn't expect her to. Survival came first. They both knew that the cave was their only chance. It wasn't much of a shelter, but it was better than open ground, better than staying in the wreckage where they had no cover. Logan hadn't gotten a good look at it before, only a glimpse of darkened rock peeking out from the ice. But he prayed it wasn't just a shallow indent in the mountain. If it didn't go deep enough, if they trapped themselves in there with no way to escape, it wouldn't matter how much distance they put between themselves and the beasts, they'd be cornered. The creatures let out another guttural snarl, closer this time, a chilling reminder that they were still gaining ground. Logan didn't risk looking back, didn't want to see how close they actually were. It wouldn't do him any good. He focused on the dark outline ahead, on the promise of something solid, something that might give them an edge. His lungs burned, his muscles already aching from the strain, but the adrenaline drowned out most of the pain. Veyna suddenly veered slightly, moving toward him with purpose. Before he could react, she grabbed his wrist, fingers tightening like steel. Then, with a strength that startled him, she pulled. Logan barely had time to brace himself before he was moving faster, his feet barely keeping up with the sudden burst of momentum. It wasn't just a simple tug. She was dragging him, her speed nearly doubling as she propelled them both forward, her body moving like a blur of motion. He wasn't sure how she was doing it, how she wasn't sinking into the snow like he was, but he didn't question it. He just let her pull him, let her guide them toward the mouth of the cave before their pursuers could close the distance. They reached the entrance in what felt like seconds, the rock rising up around them like a jagged wall of salvation. Logan stumbled slightly as they crossed inside, his boots scraping against uneven stone, his breath coming in harsh gasps. As the sudden change in terrain threw him off balance, Veyna didn't stop. She yanked him forward, deeper into the cave, her grip still firm on his wrist, her ears twitching, as if she were listening for something in the darkness ahead. Logan finally managed to wrench his arm free, planting his feet and spinning toward the entrance just as the creatures came into view. They were massive, their hulking forms barely visible through the swirling snow, their black eyes locked onto the cave's entrance. As they slowed to stop, they didn't charge inside, not yet. Instead, they lingered just beyond the threshold, their breath misting in the air, their nostrils flaring as they sniffed the cave's interior, testing, waiting. Logan gritted his teeth and raised his pistol, aiming at the closest one. He didn't fire, not yet. Wasting shots wouldn't help him here, not unless he knew they were going to come in after them. He kept his grip steady, his body still as he assessed the situation. Veyna was beside him, her breathing calm despite the tension in her stance. She was watching them carefully, her expression unreadable, her body angled slightly forward, ready. The creatures lingered for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly one of them let out a deep rumbling growl and took a step back. Another followed, and then just like that they turned and vanished into the storm, disappearing as suddenly as they had come. Logan exhaled, sharply lowering his weapon, his muscles still wound tight from the adrenaline. He didn't trust that they were gone. They had backed off, but not out of fear. They had chosen not to pursue them further. That wasn't the kind of behavior he wanted to see in predators. It meant they were smart. It meant they were planning something. Veyna was still watching the entrance, her body tense, her ears twitching at the faint sounds outside. Then, after a long moment, she turned to him and let out a quiet exhale, something that almost sounded like relief. Logan ran a hand through his damp hair shaking off the last of his nerves. "They'll be back," he muttered, knowing she wouldn't understand, but saying it anyway. "They're not done with us." She didn't need to understand the words to agree. She simply nodded, confirming what they both already knew now, that the immediate danger had passed. Logan turned his attention to the cave itself. It wasn't just a cave. The walls weren't naturally formed. He could tell that immediately. They were too smooth in certain areas, too deliberate. This place had been made. By who, he had no idea. But it wasn't just some random hole in the mountain. Someone or something had built it. Veyna moved ahead of him, her fingers brushing against the stone, her expression thoughtful. She recognized this place. That much was obvious. She knew what it was, or at least what it used to be. Logan wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. He kept his pistol ready as they moved deeper inside, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. The deeper they went, the more the walls changed. The ice gave way to something older, something metallic, hidden beneath the frost, barely visible, but unmistakable. He reached out and ran his fingers along it, feeling the cold, solid texture of metal. This was no natural cave. This had once been a structure. He turned to Veyna, who was staring at him, now her expression unreadable. He gestured to the walls, then back to her, silently asking the question he couldn't put into words. Her lips parted slightly, like she was hesitating. Then finally she spoke. "Prison." Logan froze. The word was accented, slightly broken, but clear. It sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He looked back at the walls, at the metal hidden beneath layers of ice, at the way the structure had been swallowed by the planet over time. A prison. His stomach sank. Who or what had been imprisoned here, and more importantly, were they still here? The word hung in the air between them, cold and heavy. Prison. Logan let it settle in his mind, his pulse slowing, steadying, but the weight of it pressed against his ribs like a warning. He exhaled sharply, his breath fogging in the dim light, as his gaze swept the walls again, now seeing them for what they really were, not just the bones of some abandoned shelter, not just ancient ruins buried under layers of ice. This place had been built to keep something in, and now they were standing inside it. He turned back to Veyna, studying her face, trying to gauge what wasn't being said. Her expression had hardened slightly, her usual quiet intensity shadowed by something else, caution, maybe even regret. She had brought him here because it was the only shelter, but he could see it now, the way her fingers twitched slightly against the cold metal, the way she held herself just a little too stiffly. She had wanted to come back here. This place meant something to her. This was where they had left her. Logan didn't push for more. He knew she wouldn't give it to him. Not yet. Instead, he focused on the immediate problem. They had a moment to breathe, but it wouldn't last. The creatures outside weren't gone. They were waiting, and that meant they needed to fortify their position before night fell. He moved deeper into the structure, keeping one hand on his pistol. As he carefully stepped over ice-covered debris, the deeper they went, the clearer it became that this place hadn't been abandoned. Naturally, it had been gutted. Walls were scorched, metal beams twisted from heat damage, the remains of what looked like machinery torn apart and scattered like someone or something had ripped through it with intent. This hadn't just been a place of containment. Something violent had happened here. Something had fought its way out. Veyna followed him, her presence silent but steady, her eyes flicking between the walls and the darkness ahead. She moved like she knew this place, like she had walked these halls before. But when he glanced at her, she didn't meet his gaze. Whatever had happened here, whatever had led to her exile on this frozen wasteland, she wasn't ready to talk about it. Logan didn't have time to care, not right now. He crouched near what looked like an old security terminal. The screen cracked, its interface dead beneath a thick layer of frost. Useless. The technology was ancient. Nothing he could salvage, nothing that would tell them what this place had really been. But as he moved his hand along the surface, his fingers brushed against something odd, a symbol carved deep into the metal, barely visible beneath the ice, but undeniably deliberate. He brushed more frost away, revealing its full shape. It wasn't just a marking, it was a warning, a circle broken down the center by a jagged slash. He didn't recognize it, but something about it made his gut tighten, an instinctive primal reaction that sent a chill crawling down his spine. This place hadn't been a prison for criminals, it had been a containment zone for something dangerous. Veyna made a sound, quiet, almost hesitant. Logan looked up, catching the way her gaze lingered on the symbol, the way her tail flicked slightly behind her, not in its usual slow searching way, but with unease. "You know what this means, don't you?" Logan's voice was low, even though he knew she wouldn't understand the words. But she understood the intent. She swallowed once, then finally, slowly, she nodded. That wasn't what he wanted to see. His jaw tightened as he straightened, trying to think through the situation logically. The creatures outside weren't random wildlife. They had been guarding this place, patrolling. That's why they had stopped at the entrance. That's why they had been waiting instead of attacking outright. They weren't hunting them. They were making sure nothing got out. Logan's stomach twisted, but he shoved the thought down. It didn't matter. He had a more immediate problem: securing the damn entrance before those things decided to stop playing sentries and start tearing their way in. He turned sharply on his heel, heading back toward the mouth of the cave. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the gaps in the rock, carrying with it the deep, distant sounds of the creatures still waiting. He couldn't see them anymore, but he knew they were there, stalking, calculating. He moved quickly, grabbing a length of fallen metal and jamming it into the entrance, his narrowest point, wedging it into place as a makeshift barricade. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would slow anything down if they tried to force their way inside. Veyna watched him, her expression unreadable, but after a moment, she moved to help, finding more pieces to reinforce the blockade. They worked in silence, neither of them wasting energy on unnecessary words. Logan focused on the task: keep moving, keep the mind busy. Don't think too much about the fact that they were hiding inside an ancient, ruined prison. Once they were done, he let out a slow breath, stepping back to assess their work. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough for now. Veyna stood beside him, arms folded over herself, her breath fogging in the air. She looked up at him, watching, waiting. Then, without a word, she moved closer, pressing herself against his side, seeking warmth. It was so matter-of-fact that Logan didn't even have the energy to tense up this time. He just let it happen. The silence stretched. His mind was still racing, still calculating every possible outcome, but exhaustion was beginning to creep in, the kind that couldn't be ignored forever. He rubbed a hand down his face, exhaling slowly. "This planet's trying to kill me," he muttered. Veyna made a small sound, something close to amusement, and for the first time he realized she understood more than she let on. She wasn't just mimicking behavior, she was learning. That thought should have unsettled him, but strangely it didn't. Logan looked at her, at the way she curled into his warmth like it was instinct, at the intelligence in her sharp gaze, at the quiet way she had chosen to stand beside him rather than leave him behind. This planet might be trying to kill him, but she was, and that was the only thing keeping him alive. The night passed in uneasy silence, broken only by the distant howls of the creatures still lurking beyond the cave's entrance. Logan didn't sleep. He leaned against the cold metal wall, his eyes flickering between the flickering beacon's weak glow and the jagged shadows stretching across the ruined interior. His body ached from exhaustion, but his mind refused to shut down. Too many questions, too many unknowns. The prison, the creatures, and nothing about this situation made sense. And the more time he spent trapped on this ice-covered rock, the more certain he became that there was something deeper at play. He shifted slightly, feeling the weight of her still pressed against his side. She had barely moved all night, her body curled into his warmth, her tail looped loosely around his leg. He should have been more uncomfortable with it, should have put distance between them. But at some point exhaustion had worn away his resistance. The cold was merciless, and he wasn't going to waste energy pretending he didn't need the extra heat just as much as she did. Veyna stirred, her breath warm against his shoulder as she shifted slightly, her long lashes fluttering. As she blinked awake, she didn't startle, didn't pull away. Instead, she looked up at him with those unnervingly bright eyes, scanning his face with an intensity that made him feel like she was reading something inside him, rather than just looking. Then, without a word, she stretched, rolling her shoulders before slipping away from him, her tail rushing against his leg. As she rose to her feet, she moved through the ruined space with an ease that suggested familiarity, her fingers grazing the old walls as she stepped lightly over debris. She wasn't just wandering, she was searching. Logan rubbed his hands over his face, trying to force the stiffness from his limbs before he pushed himself up as well. What are you looking for? He knew she wouldn't understand, but the words felt necessary, something to break the tension that had settled thick between them. V didn't answer, but she glanced at him over her shoulder. Her